I'm Renee McGregor. I am a sports dietitian that specialises in RED, eating disorders, female health and athlete health and performance. And you are listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the very good folk at Precision Hydration and the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Of course, each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes, interest editions, coaches' corners, featured performers, and expert editions. And hot off the back of last week's very popular featured performer episode featuring multiple world triathlon champion and Sport Australia and World Triathlon Hall of Fame member, Emma Carney. You are in for a real treat today as we explore all things fueling for health and performance on this expert edition featuring leading sports dietitian and author, UK-based Renee McGregor. Now, by way of bio, Renee McGregor is prolific. In clinical practice, Renee specialises in relative energy deficiency in sport, eating disorders, the female athlete, and of course, athletic health and performance. Her clinical practice and knowledge is supported by extensive experience working in both clinical and performance nutrition, including the Olympic Games in London 2012, the Paralympic Games in Rio in 2016, and the Commonwealth Games in 2018 on the Gold Coast. Renee is the best-selling author of Fast Fuels training series and Orthorexia, When Healthy Eating Goes Bad. And today's expert edition is an exploration around all things fueling for the athlete. Now, historically on the Physical Performance Show, whenever we have featured an expert in the field of dietetics or nutrition, these episodes have been extremely popular. There's a bunch of learnings coming your way as Renee shares with us today the signs of underfueling for athletes, what to look for both the male and female athlete, the effect of disordered eating when it comes to an athlete's desire to be in energy balance, the top mistakes that athletes make when it comes to fueling for health and performance, and so much more. So get ready for the learnings. Here is my conversation with Renee McGregor, leading sports dietitian on all things fueling for health and performance, brought to you by Precision Hydration. Renee McGregor, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you so much for having me, Brad. I am very, very excited. This is one of my favourite podcasts, so It's very weird.
Well, Renee, you are featuring on an expert edition for good reason, and I have been a follower of your output, your teachings, your content for quite some time. We were connected through a mutual friend over here in Australia, so a big shout out and thank you to Jen. But Renee, your expertise is in such an important area of health and performance, something that we've touched on quite a few times in the show's history to date, but it's one of those key topics that I don't think we can talk about enough, and that is the topic of fueling for health and performance. And before we threw live to recording, we were sharing around some of the challenges in your home nation there of the UK, or your home country there, England, with the impact of the pandemic and isolation on people's coping mechanisms. Can you share a little bit just around the context before we sort of get a bit of a back date of your career to date?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is one of my biggest concerns. So I think I find it really fascinating. I've done a lot of teaching, actually. Just even the last few days, I've been teaching quite a lot of university students on this particular area. And the title of my presentation is, why do we turn to food and exercise as a coping mechanism? And I think often people are like, well, what do you mean? I think there's so much misconception around disordered eating, exercise dependency, eating disorders, and nobody really appreciates. Like, they sort of get that it's something to do with control. Like, that word is thrown around so much. And even when clients come to clinic, I'll say, do you have an understanding of why you have these behaviors? Because fundamentally they're ingrained behaviors. And they'll say, well, it's to do with control. And I'm like, well, what does that actually mean? Like, what does that mean to you? And when you start getting into the nitty gritty of it, they don't know. They've just heard this word being thrown around, And I guess it's always my job to help raise awareness of why. Because if you understand why you have a behavior, you are more likely to then be able to challenge and change that behavior. If you have no idea why you're doing what you're doing, you're just going to stay working on the surface. So I always say, like, food and exercise, they're like the sticky plaster that you put on a really deep wound. And you never get to the bottom of the cause of that wound. You never kind of get to it, and it's becoming more and more infected and more problematic. And at some point, that plaster's not going to work anymore. But maybe initially it did. And I guess that's it. Food and exercise work as a way of denying uncomfortable and difficult emotions that an individual doesn't want to experience. And that's not necessarily conscious. So how it often presents is this kind of, the way I describe it is blind chatter. There's that kind of conversation that goes on within you, the narrative that we all probably hear in our heads, and it can be different for everybody. But we've all had those bad days where all we hear is us beating ourselves up in our head, or all those days where actually maybe we have a conversation that's going on in our head about a situation we think is going to happen. But these conversations, these narratives that are going on within us, if we are constantly negative towards ourselves, if we're constantly telling ourselves we're not good enough, if we're constantly seeing our inadequacies, if we're allowing our environments and the situations around us to feed into that unworthiness, they become bigger and bigger, but they also become very, very physically and mentally uncomfortable to cope with. The thing about that is that that's very conceptual, right? If we think, thoughts, feelings, emotions, they're not things that we can hold on to. They're not things that we can do anything with. But food and exercise are things we can use. These are physical things we can do something with. And so we almost set up this false sense of security. Like, if I eat in a certain way, it almost feels like you're containing yourself. You've got a sense of that. I've got a sense of security and control because this is okay. I'm handling this. This makes me feel safe. And the same with exercise. The example I use a lot, and I know and I love the fact that you have questioned this because I have questioned it a lot as well, but this whole 10,000 steps a day, right? And so it's like somewhere somebody has said 10,000 steps a day is the magic number that we all have to do every day to stay fit and healthy. Now, some of us will take that on. Some of us will be like, okay, well, we'll do our best. And some people will take it to an extreme, which is if they do not do their 10,000 steps a day, in their mind, something dreadful is going to happen. And I guess this helps to explain where we are today. In the UK, particularly, the pandemic is really problematic, not just in the number of cases that are being affected and the impact it's having on the NHS, but actually the effect the lockdown is now having on our mental health, our economy, our relationships. I mean, it's not a fun place to live right now. And I'm going to be brutally honest, it really isn't. And what I see is that there's so much uncertainty and so much threat around. And those individuals that struggle with uncertainty in particular, and this is quite key because this is quite important for most eating disorders, is that individuals who struggle with uncertainty, that space of I don't know, have this tendency to then jump to a definitive negative because it's a much easier thing to hold on to than it is to sit in the I don't know. So if we go back to the 10,000 steps a day, if I don't do my 10,000 steps a day, I won't be healthy is the kind of definitive negative. And yet you don't know that. right? We don't know. If we don't do 10,000 steps a day, is something awful going to happen to us? Probably not. But that individual has created this limiting belief that keeps them in this place because it makes them feel safe. But the problem is it's not the answer. And when 10,000 steps a day doesn't work, maybe they go to 20,000 and maybe they go to 30,000 and so on, because it's never enough, because it's not the answer. So it's kind of a insight, I guess, into why people may reach out towards food and exercise. And I guess also why we're seeing such a big increase. I mean, in the UK, it's been identified that particularly in the adolescent population, eating disorders has quadrupled this year. I mean, that's huge. That's not a small number. That is huge. And there's not a single bed available for inpatient treatment if it's needed in this country. So it puts a lot of pressure on the community support. So although we have a private clinic, it's putting a lot of pressure on our clinic, and we're private. So you can imagine in the community under the National Health Service, what pressure those individuals are on. And it's scary because, again, I'm sure you know the statistics, but particularly anorexia nervosa, it has the highest mortality rate of any mental health problem in the world. Wow. So this is a very, very complex, sad, and difficult area to work in.
Yeah, gosh. And I mean, the word that jumps out there, Renee, is the control word. And as you say, it's something tangible that we can reach out and control is our exercise habits or our eating. And I don't think there's a single person listening in that can't relate to that when there is some sense of uncertainty in their world, whether it's the control of the session they want to execute or the self-perceived virtuousness of eating clean. I say that in brackets because it's not really a virtue, is it? And it doesn't, imbue any special powers or improve sense of self. It's it's something that we can control. And I think, can you paint, Renee, a little picture around? Because one of the frustrations I have in clinical practice as a practicing physio, dealing with a lot of endurance athletes who are often dealing with bone stress injuries, and more often than not, there's a contribution from an underfueling point of view. And we'll talk about this red S concept, obviously, today, this underfueling, is that I don't have any problems with my fueling. I'm a stable weight. I'm an athlete. I'm functioning fine. How could I be underfueled? And often there's some resistance from the parents when you might suggest, hey, you need to connect. You'd benefit from connecting with a dietitian. I feed my child a lot. There's almost a sense of, please don't question what I feed my child. And I find it sometimes quite challenging to navigate that. Can you speak to that idea, Renee, that even if you're out there, you're a fine functioning athlete, it doesn't mean that you might not be underfueled, and not to switch off because you hear the word eating disorders, because there is this other side of it which can be unintentional, a word you referred to in one of your books, orthorexia.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating topic. And I think to fully understand it, we kind of have to go back to energy balance studies. And I think, I mean, you'll probably get as frustrated as I am, but sports science has been dumbed down so much. Like since the advent of Instagram, more and more people are talking about fitness and food than ever before. Like it's almost like it's so much part of our identity, how we eat, what we do, what we look like more than it's ever been. And obviously that comes with frustrations. I think particularly initially when I'm talking about Instagram, I'm talking about social media, Instagram in particular. When Instagram was born, if we call it, it probably didn't have the likes of you and I on there. It didn't have qualified practitioners who work in the field, who do the academic research on there, because it was almost like a sexy, glamorous thing rather than a credible educational platform. And I didn't really I didn't even know what it was. I didn't even understand it, to be honest, until I think when I wrote Orthorexia, and it came out in 2017, and I was encouraged by marketing and publishing companies to use Instagram, because it was a very important tool for marketing. So that's kind of where it started for me, and I had no idea. I still don't really know what I'm doing most of the time, but what I know, I have done is I have created a very strong education platform where people can go and learn a lot about all these things we're talking about today. And it can be very, very useful. But it's also very frustrating because there are still a big number of individuals on there, who probably don't have that sports science, hands-on, working in the performance world experience, as well as understanding all the literature around it. So there's, we talk about evidence practice, but evidence practice is not just reading a paper and going, oh, this paper says X, so that's what we're going to execute. It's reading all the papers in the field. It's having an informed decision, but it's also knowing how you apply that to the person that's in front of you. Because as you and I both know, humans are not textbook. So what might work for one person might not work for another one. And that doesn't mean that the science is wrong. It's just that we're also slightly biased by science because we can only answer the questions that are being asked. And yet humans are going to come along and there's going to be all sorts of things that come up with them because we're not rational creatures. I think that's one thing. The other thing I'd say is that we often lose sight of the fact that the human body is incredible. There are so many different biological processes going on all at the same time within our body that keep us alive. And for some reason, we've forgotten about that. We just focus on all the energy expenditure we do from a physical movement point of view, but we've forgotten about the fact that we need energy for digestion. We need energy for our immune system. We need energy for our endocrine system. We need energy for our brain. We need energy for respiration. It's constant. The body is never asleep as such. We might be, our brains might be, but the body's constantly going because it has to keep us alive. And I find it incredibly fascinating. This is probably because I did a biochemistry degree first. So I understand how it all works at that very cellular, molecular level. And I find it interesting how, the body identifies there's a drop, maybe there's a drop in calcium because you're doing physical movement or you've had a particularly high protein meal. And so the blood pH changes, you get calcium ions coming from your bone to kind of keep the levels of calcium normal in your blood because that's what you need to function properly. And then everything sort of stays the same. But then behind the scenes, if you're not looking after your bones, if you're not giving yourself enough calcium in your diet, your bones can't replete that calcium. And so this is one way you can start to reduce your bone density. It's not the only way, but one way. But it's just one example of how the body interacts and keeps everything, again, like homeostatic control. So I guess when people say, but my weight's stable, so how can I not be eating enough? The thing to remember is that energy balance, so reaching energy balance is what humans do. There's a biological bias towards achieving energy balance all the time, regardless of where that is, if that makes sense. So this is why it's so difficult when you have overweight, obese individuals who are trying to lose weight because their body's kind of always working against them to a certain degree. And the other thing we know is that if you increase that deficit too much, so if you are somebody who needs to lose weight, but you increase that deficit too much, compensatory behaviors kick in to prevent you from dropping your weight too fast, too quickly, because the body doesn't want to do it. And actually, to maintain a healthy weight, this is really important. So for an athlete to be physically really well, as in they have enough energy to perform and adapt from their training. So that's something I would say is always worth having a conversation is they might be the right weight, but are you adapting? Are you noticing changes to your muscle mass? Are you getting leaner? Are you finding you're getting stronger? Are you getting faster? How is your performance? Because this is a real telltale area. And for an athlete to work optimally, what we found is that you need to have a very high energy intake alongside a moderately high training output. And that's how you maintain really good health and performance. But what we often see, particularly in the world we live in, is that we're constantly promoting this move more, eat less, which actually sets up everybody to fail. Because if you, like I said, if you have these big deficits, you actually end up with compensatory behaviors. So if they're presenting time and time again, Brad, to you with issues, whether it's ligaments, tendons, pains, aches, whatever it might be, you're right. It's a big indicator that this is probably a fueling issue. And yes, their body is steady, but the fact that they are continually breaking down would suggest that the body is having to compensate. So all the energy they're taking in is being used for the training that they're doing, the movement they're doing, but actually it's down-regulated internal biological systems so that repair can't happen, recovery can't happen, tissues can't be replaced, adaptation, like the signaling, those very clear signaling pathways that occur when you do exercise, their demands can't be met. And obviously in some extreme cases, then you may start to see hormonal changes. Obviously in females, you may notice amenorrhea, so no menstruation. In guys, testosterone levels can drop, and that can have an effect on their morning erectile function. Like, it's not an easy question to ask people, but it's a question that I think all practitioners working in sports science need to feel confident asking. So just because your body weight is stable, that does not mean that you are balanced. And I think that's really important. Like, it's a big area of RED-S that is often overlooked, particularly if you kind of can see that things are not quite right. Like, maybe you're feeling a bit tired, maybe your sleep's a bit off, perhaps you're not recovering particularly well between training sessions, and you might go and see a doctor, or you might go and see a physio or whoever. And because you look okay, the individual that if the practitioner you're going to has no education on RED-S or understands what it could be or how problematic it could be missed, because you're in their eyes, you're eating all right, you're doing exercise, and you look all right. So tick, 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 right? So you have to go and look at slightly deeper level. And everybody that comes to our clinic, we actually do a full screen of bloods on, because you can get so much more information looking at metabolic function, inflammatory function, hormones. You can see so much looking at what's going on with hormones. So yeah, I think weight's not really a good indicator of someone being healthy as such.
And therefore, from the outside looking in, coach, parent, other athletes, we cannot pass assessment on someone's fueling by appearance alone. No,
not at all. Not at all. If anything, I as a trained eye, I can probably look at someone and go, and this sounds harsh, and I don't want it to sound harsh. I want people to understand what I'm talking about. But if you're looking at a runner, for example, or an endurance athlete, and they look, as I call it, a bit fluffy. So they're slim, they're definitely not big, but there's no actual muscle tone. There's no definition in their muscle. And they're doing triathletes doing 20 hours a week, runners doing 12, 15 hours a week, and there's no muscle definition. You have to question what's going on there. And this is not just about phenotypes. Like, I know people say, yeah, but I'm an ectomorph, so I don't put muscle mass down. But actually, if you're doing the right training and you're fueling, you will put sufficient muscle mass down for you, and I think that's kind of like a key. Again, a trained eye could pick it up. Not everybody will, and that's okay. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? I did a post last week on the importance of being a certain body fat percentage, particularly in females, for menstruation to occur. And it was the back of a friend of mine who had done a post on body fat percentage for aesthetics versus body fat percentage for fertility and health. And we sort of agreed that it would be useful to do another one based on menstruation and, how important that is. Because again, I think it's often overlooked how important menstruation is, particularly in women, because it's seen as a hassle. It's always treated with quite a lot of negativity. Oh God, it's that time of the month again, or you're moody because, and there's a lot of negativity around it, which it's not fun being a female sometimes at all. Yeah. But understanding that it is a very clear indicator that you are fueling your body right efficiently, especially if you're an athlete, and you are providing it with enough energy, not only to do the work that you're asking of your body, but also the work that your body needs to stay alive. And so you're more likely then, if your reproductive hormones are within good levels, that means you're going to be producing growth hormone. So that means you're going to get the adaptation. But if your reproductive hormones are a bit off, then probably your adaptation hormones are going to be off. Your hunger hormones are going to be off. Your digestive hormones are going to be off. And I think it's understanding, again, going back to that, how it all interlinks and how it all is so important that you can't, and I guess that's why I get frustrated with sometimes with sports science when it's like, we're going to look at X to see if Y happens without looking at, well, actually doing X might affect ABC over here, you know? And I think you have to look at the person holistically. You can't just look at one aspect of an individual, because if you do that, you're not going to be able to give them the best practice. And
Renee, just sort of driving home some of those teachings there, the body is never asleep. I think, of course, we feel like it might be because, you know, cognitively we are asleep, but it doesn't mean our biological processes have ended. And we don't need to look any further than that to wake up. And if we were doing body mass measures pre and post sleeping, they're different, right? Because things are happening. And every athlete wants to improve, recreationally competitive elite. They'll put the hours in. Often the training is not the problem. You know, people are motivated, particularly the athletic individuals. Yet if there's a fueling issue, they being myself potentially as well, we may be putting a very handbrake on the very thing that we're aspiring to improve, just out of often ignorance that we may be underfueled, and also the mistaken belief that because our body weight's stable, which tends to be the biggest belief, mistaken or myth, if you like, I tend to hear espoused, therefore I must be fueled okay. So just to summarise your Renee McGregor's clinical signs, just once again for the athlete just to look out for, to indicate that they may not be fueled enough. Can you just go through in bullet point fashion, Renee?
Yeah, sure. So some of the key things would be, so initially you might see people, this is where it gets problematic, because sometimes people do see an immediate improvement in their performance, but it's like a one-off, and then it stagnates and then usually deteriorates. So you don't get that adaptation. Recovery between sessions can become more and more reduced. So you might not always feel ready for your next session physically, and I'd say mentally. So one of the questions I ask a lot of people is, what's your motivation to train on that day? Like, how motivated are you to get out of bed and go and do what you need to do? And, you know, we all have those days where a bit of fatigue kicks in, and that's okay. But when it's day after day after day, then that's problematic, and that definitely needs to be addressed. You may notice that actually you feel a bit more anxious generally around fueling, maybe around training. Like you identify that you're tired, or maybe you get sick and you have to take a day off, and that creates a lot of anxiety. For me, that's a big red flag. If there's anxiety and needing to stop or having to eat differently, then I think you definitely need to pay attention to that. That's huge, even if your body weight is the same. Sleep can become affected, because if your body is in low energy availability, then your body will try and stay awake to look for food. So it's, again, something people don't always realize. Wow. You might find that your digestive system becomes a bit compromised, in the sense that a lot of people assume it's IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome. But actually, although the symptoms are very similar, generally speaking, what's happening is if there's not enough energy going into the body, then of course everything slows down, including digestion. And so the movement of food through the gut slows right down, and that can be very, very physically uncomfortable. So that's something I see a lot. A lot of people come to clinic with that first, and then you do the assessment and you can go, this is interesting. I don't think this is IBS. This is,
wow,
delayed gastric emptying. This is slow motility through the gut. So that's quite a big one, which is often missed completely. And the interesting thing about that is often the individual will try and start excluding things, so then making it even worse because they're reducing their energy intake even further. So that's one to definitely be aware of. And then obviously we've got the more physical signs, in the sense that in women, menstruation can become erratic. It doesn't have to stop necessarily. It might become lighter. You might notice your cycle gets shorter or longer. So either is potentially a sign that something's not in balance. So I think the thing to remember is that it has to be different from what you normally do. So if you normally have a 25-day cycle, then that's your cycle, then that's fine. But if suddenly it starts to go to 35 days or 19 days, and that's continuous, that's usually an indicator something is a bit off. So if you have very short cycles, would probably, and we can't say for certain, but would probably indicate that you're not ovulating because you're not able to maintain the luteal phase of your cycle. And if it's very long, it might be that ovulation is delayed, possibly because of exercise intensity. And so that's why then your follicular phase has been extended. So, remember, the body will always try and preserve as much as possible. So it might be that you go quite a long way before your periods actually get completely stop. But obviously if they do stop, and particularly if you miss 3 consecutive periods, then that's a sign that something's really not great. So any changes I'd be mindful of and just be aware that it could be. I mean, obviously, again, something we've seen in the pandemic is that the anxiety and the stress around the uncertainty is also potentially affecting some women's cycles. So it's not, don't panic, but just be mindful it could be. Yeah. And in guys, like I said, morning erectile function can decrease to less than 5 a week. But guys, if it gets to that point, things are probably pretty bad. And that's the bit that's scary, because in women, we get quite a quick sign. In guys, we don't. And almost women's bodies are a little bit more sensitive to a certain degree than guys. They can get away with it for a little bit longer. So I think it's just, and it's not as easy to see. So I just think you have to be really careful. Like I've had a lot of male athletes coming into clinic, and they're probably in a worse position than the females when you start to look at their bloods and everything else. But they wouldn't have picked up on it, because until it was really, like, they might have heard me on a podcast or read my book or something and then gone, oh my God, this is me. But it's a lot harder, I think. And for me, it's a big concern, because I feel like there's a whole load of male athletes out there who are probably struggling and don't know where to go for help and don't know how to get help and don't even understand what's going on for them. And I think, please don't sit there in silence. Go and get help, speak to someone, anyone, reach out to us if need be, and we can signpost. But definitely don't sit there in silence if you're starting to notice any of these symptoms that I've discussed just now.
Because they can be indicators of being underfueled. And yes, the athletic population's focused on performance, but this can have quite serious longer-term health consequences. Can you touch on those, Renee, before we loop back, and you can share around the prevalence of this, in terms of the population? What are the longer-term implications health-wise? We have touched on them in the past in various episodes, but I don't think it can be missed, just stating how important this is.
So, I mean, obviously, one of the biggest things will be around the decrease in hormones, particularly testosterone and estrogen, which we know has a significant negative impact on bone health. So, if someone's coming into your clinic, Brad, and is kind of, on another stress fracture, this is not a good sign. This is, it probably suggests that there's some sort of decrease in bone density. Now, of course, 70% of your bone health is genetic as well. So, we have to be aware of that. And obviously how your bone architecture can also have an impact. So it's not saying that it's always down to underfueling. But again, you can usually tell, because if you do DEXA scans, so you look at kind of the bone density in your spine and you look at the bone density in your femur, the bone density in our spine is trabecular bone, which is directly impacted by hormones and nutrition. So if that is significantly lower than your femur, that would indicate, probably, particularly if you're an endurance athlete, because you do a lot of loading on your femur, that would indicate that most likely the issues are around low energy availability and poor fueling at some stage. We see, especially if individuals have had eating disorders in their teenage years, when obviously you're putting down a lot of your peak bone mass, sometimes that in itself is the problem, is that even though they might be well in their 20s, if they had a significant period of time, say between the ages of 11 and sort of 17, 18, where they have been affected, that can be enough to then obviously cause stress fractures and problems in the future. Now, you can help these individuals. Don't sit there and panic.
Yes.
But it is a problem. So the bone health is one of the big things. We've got people, unfortunately, in our clinic who are as young as 24 who've got severe osteoporosis. And, that's sad because they have these aspirations to be these incredible athletes, and they've probably got the talent, but because of the mismanagement, the poor kind of understanding of the longer term effects, they might not ever reach their potential. And that is a concern and a worry. And I know, like, in the UK, there was a statistic that came out quite a few years ago now, probably back in 2016. It was that only 54% of junior athletes made it to a mature athlete level, or senior athlete level, due to over competing and overtraining as a junior. And that's not necessarily, I don't want to say that that's all about coaching. That's also about the individual and not learning how to manage expectations when you're very young, and kind of constantly having this cracking of the whip to be better. And I think a lot of junior athletes have this thing that they have to be the best tomorrow, rather than thinking about actually, your probably career is going to be 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, depending on when you start. And so actually, if you look after yourself in these early years, you could be peaking in your 20s, mid-20s, late 20s. And that's the time when you should be working for. So that longevity and that bigger picture. And I think where coaches do have a role is helping an individual to understand that. We're not worried about what you do from 16 to 20, but we are concerned about, how we step it up from 20 to 26, for example. And I think that's really, really important. Other long-term effects, obviously, again, going back to the hormones. So again, testosterone and estrogen are both very, very important for the uptake of serotonin in the brain. So if these levels are low, then we do see that mood, there are more likely to be depressive phases, and the individual will be very, very low in mood. And interestingly, a few years ago, a lady came into my clinic, and she was in her late 30s, nearly early 40s, and she'd had an eating disorder probably 20 odd years, if I'm honest, and she'd kind of almost given up hope. But I think again, had heard me or read something, and she came to the clinic, and she just said, "Look, I've been on antidepressants my whole life, pretty much, and I've been told I'll never come off them." And I was like, "That's interesting." And I said, like, "What, tell me about your periods, what's been going on?" And she goes, "Well, I haven't had one for 20 years. And I was like, "So has anybody ever measured your estrogen levels?" And she's like, "No." And when we did, they were like literally non-existent. And I was like, you know what? There is a possibility that if we can get your menstruation to restart, then your mood might change. And she was really surprised. But anyway, we did. It was a bit of a procedure, but we got there. And she actually sent me an email a few weeks ago saying, "I never thought I'd be off the antidepressants, but I am." And a lot of that was just to do with the fact that there just wasn't enough estrogen there wasn't enough estrogen around to help her with her mood. So we have to also remember that estrogen is really important for cognitive function, and also anxiety. So there was a study that came out last year, which demonstrated that particularly in anorexic patients, it could be quite useful to use like an estrogen patch in order to help manage anxiety, because there's such a heightened anxiety when estrogen is low. And also this then creates more and more of a problem in terms of treatment. So I'm not sure. I don't think it's used particularly widely around, but it's definitely something I've recommended to individuals. In extreme cases I've worked with, I have then sort of spoken to their consultants, and sort of we've gone through the papers, and we've done that as it's not a long term, it's just a short term process to try and help improve that anxiety. So then you can start working on some of the cognitive aspects of eating disorders and get them to restore some weight and energy, because it all has to happen. It all has to happen at the same time. I think that's something that I'm very aware of, is that generally speaking, when people are treated for eating disorders, particularly restrictive eating disorders where weight has been lost, the focus seems to be on weight gain before you can do any psychological impact. But I go back to where we started, which is if you don't help the individual understand why they have their behaviors, you can't encourage them to change. So yes, absolutely, the brain, the structure of the brain, the way the brain functions is severely compromised when there's not enough energy going there. And, thoughts are very irrational. And we know that from the science, that it's a very, very complicated situation that's going on. But equally, you can't get somebody to increase their intake if we don't help them to understand why they have their behavior. So I think sometimes it is difficult, and there's no easy answer. I'm not sitting here kind of slating the way it's treated. It's just a very, very, very complex picture in that, yes, we need energy to be increased. We need more glucose to go into the brain before we can start tackling some of those psychological aspects of what's going on, so that, you can get that two-way conversation. But equally, in order to get that to happen, you have to give them something so they understand what they're working towards. So whenever we have people come into clinic, we do have a cutoff where that's too low to work in the community because it's just too complicated and you need too much medical support at the same time. But generally speaking, we do work with people who can be severely compromised and they have very low BMIs, but we're still getting success because we tackle it not just from a food first. Obviously food first, but we tackle it from you need to do both things side by side. And I think that's really, really important for the individual. And also remember, these people are usually highly intelligent. They kind of, that's probably their downfall, is that they're highly intelligent, overthinkers, perfectionist, driven, and this is kind of also what's creating their problems. So I've gone off on a tangent, but yeah, going back to the longer term problems, I guess, fundamentally, if you don't look after yourself, then you are going to find that perhaps it is career over because your body just can't come back from the severe restrictions and the constant down regulation of biological function. But the key things probably are going to be mood, anxiety, and your body breaking down, and that is a serious problem.
You're listening to Renee McGregor, leading sports dietitian and author, on this an expert edition exploring all things fueling for health and performance. Support for today's show is brought to you by the very good folk at Precision Hydration. We recently featured co-founder of Precision Hydration, Andy Blow, on the show, episode 234. It was extremely popular, exploring hydration science. And one of the interesting learnings from that episode was that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to hydration because, quite simply, everyone loses a different amount of salt in their sweat. Now, I underwent a sweat test and it turns out that I lose about half the amount that the average athlete loses in terms of salt in my sweat. So if you've ever struggled with hydration issues like cramp during long hot sessions, then it's worth checking out precisionhydration.com. If you cannot get to a test center like I did for a sweat test, then rest assured Precision Hydration have got you covered with their free online sweat test, which outputs a personalized hydration strategy to test in training, and even better, as a listener of the show, you get 15% off your first order of electrolytes. That will match up with how much you sweat and your salt concentration. To redeem the great offer from the Precision Hydration crew, use the code PERFORMANCE, all capitals, 15 when checking out. Now, after you've taken the online sweat test at precisionhydration.com, you can also book a free 20-minute video call with the team regarding any questions that you have about your hydration to discuss your plan for your upcoming next event. It's an absolute must if you're looking to perform at your best. I'm working through the output from my sweat test and implementing my hydration plan with some upcoming events on the horizon. So I'd encourage you to jump over to precisionhydration.com and once again use the code PERFORMANCE, all one word, capitals, 15 to get 15% off your electrolyte drinks. Support for today's show also comes from the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership. Real simple, if you'd like to support the production of the show, then you can do so from just $5 per month over at Patreon. Patreon. Just search The Physical Performance Show, and there you can pledge your support for the production of the show. Now, in return, we'll grant you complimentary access to all prior live stream events, including the very popular 2020 live streams held with Dr. Shona Halson on all things recovery and Dr. Stephen Seiler on all things polarized training. And you'll also receive free access to all upcoming planned live stream events. So thank you for your support. Big shout out this week to our new patron, and that is Kel Walker. Hailing from Sydney, you'll find Kel over on Instagram at Kel the Marathoner. Let's jump back with this week's featured guest on this expert edition, Renee McGregor, leading UK-based sports dietitian on all things fueling for health and performance. Can you speak, Renee, to the difference between an eating disorder and disordered eating?
Yeah, this question is asked a lot, and it's really, there's a really fine line between the two, if I'm honest. So I think the best way to describe it is, if we look at what's called an eating disorder and what's called disordered eating, I think that's probably the better way to kind of look at it. So we know that conditions like anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, these have been categorized as eating disorders. And the reason why they're categorized is because there are specific diagnostic criteria we can use to label someone, I guess, if you want, or to diagnose someone with these problems. So obviously with anorexia, it's kind of this incessant fear of weight and holding a normal weight and trying to maintain a very, very low weight with obviously body dysmorphia and other psychological aspects going on. With bulimia, it's a case of purging. And this doesn't mean just vomiting. This could mean over-exercising. This could mean taking laxatives. But it tends to be this, this method of probably maintaining a fairly normal body weight, but through a very restrict purge or binge purge type cycle. And this needs to be happening twice a week for it to be categorized as bulimia, as a minimum, that is. And then also you have binge eating disorder, which, again, people get stuck in this very binge restrict type cycle. And again, this needs to be happening at least minimum of twice a week in order for it to become diagnosed. So we got very clear criteria around what an eating disorder is. In all cases, there is psychological and physical health issues. So in all the anorexia, binge eating, bulimia, there is a big element of physical health deteriorating alongside, so in anorexia, that very low body weight is a big concern, can affect your heart, affects how you think. Physically, you can be very, very poorly. With bulimia, obviously with the purging, especially if you're purging, so my biggest concern, and I think this is the one that's silent and people don't talk about, but if you're bulimic and you are making yourself sick and you're over-exercising, your potassium levels could drop without you realizing, and that is serious. Like that is what can potentially create a cardiac arrest. So I get very nervous working around bulimics who also exercise. Like it scares me, because unless they're being medically monitored, it's very, very frightening. And they won't realize it.
And Renee, it makes me think of it as a high-profile Australian successful Olympic swimmer who was just publicised, came out recently on social media and said she has suffered from an eating disorder. And I can't recall the diagnostic of it, whether it was bulimia or otherwise. But so there's an example of that very concern you have, a high functioning, a high outputter, energy outputter with with an eating disorder. It may well be bulimia that she was suffering or is suffering from. So I think it's key, Brad, you mentioned these can be highly successful performers, but it doesn't mean behind closed doors there's not things happening.
No, and I think actually, you're probably aware of the study by Joy et al, and then obviously Trott et al. So Trott's study came out early last year and Joy's study came out in 2016, and both indicate that there is a higher prevalence of disordered eating and dysfunctional relationships with food in those individuals that are athletic compared to their non-athletic peers. So Joy suggested 20% higher prevalence, and Trott said that individuals that had an eating disorder had 4 times more chance of also having an exercise dependency. So, you have these very, very extreme behaviors sat side by side, which is so I think there needs to be so much more awareness of that, particularly in the sports world. Again, one of the reasons I say moved away from the high performance world. I mean, I still work in the high performance world, but I guess I moved away from the Olympic world was because there was so much focus on performance and not enough support on health. And almost like they understand health, they understand mental health, and it's a bit of a tick box. Oh yeah, we've done that. But they don't really understand it, because at the end of the day, the performance of that athlete, whether they get a medal or not, whether they win or not, that's the critical thing. And I think it's probably because, a lot of it stems on that's how you get your funding, that's how you then continue. That, there's so much pressure. I mean, I've been in those environments where there's pressure on the whole team to perform in order to maintain your job. And that's a horrible place to be. Working in that level was brutal. Whether you're working in it or you're an athlete in it, it was not fun. And you have to be, I think, incredibly ego-driven, which I'm not, and probably why I was like, do you know what? This is not what I need. I don't need this. I care too much. In fact, I was told I cared too much for the athlete, and that's fine. If that's my downfall, I'll take it. And I think, with an eating disorder, it does happen in the high performance world, but it also happens in the recreational competitive world a lot more than people realize. Because I think, again, if we try and understand why, it's often because these individuals have very low self-esteem, very low self-worth. Perhaps that's from their childhood, their experiences, their interpretations. Perhaps it's part of their personality type. Everybody's slightly different. But when somebody goes in search of a body composition or a sporting achievement or an academic achievement, it's usually because they're trying to attain something they can't attain within themselves, which is worth. So, when I get to X% body fat, I'll be happy is the narrative that's going on in their head. Because again, we see so much, we hear so much, and the thoughts that we create, the beliefs that we create, they come from the sound bites that's going on around us. So if we're constantly scrolling on social media and seeing these images of, very flat stomachs, very like pecs, and kind of strong images of kind of fitness, we start to believe and perceive that that's what we've all got to achieve in order to be accepted. So that feeds into that narrative of, when I get to this point, I'll be happy. But what that also sets up is that there's this conditional acceptance of self. Only when I achieve, only when I do this, will I be accepted. And so we can almost become individuals who are like, I accept myself, but it's still conditional. It's not unconditional. And actually, personally, it's taken me I'm a very perfectionist, high-performing individual. To a certain degree, people would say you wouldn't be where you are if you weren't, to a certain degree. And it's taken me a very, very long time to totally understand what it means to be unconditionally accepting of myself. And, and what I mean by that is it's not this kind of, I find it fascinating because, when you talk about self-care a lot, people automatically assume you're talking about face masks and baths with candles and all this kind of stuff. But actually self-care is when you can turn up for yourself. It's when you know that you are there unconditionally, warts and all. When you've probably made a mistake and it makes you feel incredibly uncomfortable and icky, but yet you can still show yourself compassion and care. That is unconditional acceptance. And it's hard. But if you get to that point, what you find is that when you get to that point, you're then no longer fearful. You no longer lead these limiting beliefs of when I get to X or when I do this or if I do this, because you're no longer fearful of the potential judgment, criticism, rejection, failure, not being good enough. that is really what is keeping people in these disordered eating disorder places, because it's just this false sense of security that somehow you're safe from all this. But often the judgment is actually coming from yourself. It's perceived judgment of others, but it's actually coming from yourself. And perhaps it started because somebody made, maybe when you were younger, you were constantly compared or whatever. And that became what you learned. And I guess it's probably not enough time to explain everything in one podcast, but it's kind of important to understand that the narrative that's creative from your younger years most likely is kind of what ends up being the driving force in why you need these behaviors. Going back to disordered eating, often this now is kind of, it's usually sort of coined under the umbrella term of orthorexia, as we mentioned, earlier. And orthorexia is very much the obsession with eating correctly, with the obsession with eating purely. And I guess, you mentioned it before, it came about because people were obsessed with the hashtag eat clean. It's a difficult one. So it's not necessarily to do with body weight or body composition. I mean, that can come into it, but fundamentally it really is about wanting to be incredibly pure. If I'm pure, then I am good enough. It's that kind of, if I am absolutely the best healthy version of myself, then I am enough. That's kind of where it's coming from. Yeah. And it's difficult to diagnose because there are so many food and wellness trends that can be used as a way of disguising that you have a disordered way of eating. So to answer your question, how do you know whether you've got disordered eating or eating disorders? Eating disorders are quite easy because there are strict, there's criteria. Disordered eating is complicated because you might not appreciate it because, such and such is doing that wellness trend and they're okay. Or, everybody's going plant-based. So how can that be disordered? And I guess, it's disordered when it starts to create anxiety. So when you can't move away from it, so what I mean by that is that it's so rigid that you struggle to go and have social interaction with your peers or your friends or your family, because that would mean having to eat outside of the rules that you've created. It's problematic when it means that, you're withdrawing yourself. So when it starts to affect your daily life, like when you can't do something because you need to drink that, or you need to eat that, or you need to go and do that behavior beforehand, that's when I'd say it's more disordered. It can fall into an eating disorder, but even disordered eating can be enough to create problems psychologically and physically. And often what we find is that people might start with orthorexia and then fall into anorexia or bulimia because it just gets more and more extreme and severe. Or sometimes the opposite, that when people are recovering from anorexia and bulimia, especially if they don't completely understand what it's about, will still want an element of control, an element of keeping things safe, and they will then fall into orthorexia. So we often see this kind of transient movement between them, but they are very distinct and different as well, but with a lot of overlap around why.
You're listening to Renee McGregor, UK-based leading sports dietitian and author on all things fueling for health and performance. If you missed last week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, then it was a conversation that you'll want to catch up on at some point, featuring multi-world champion triathlete, Sport Australia and World Triathlon Hall of Fame member Emma Carney. Here's a little snippet of my conversation with Emma.
The body is basically lazy. Very, very adaptive and lazy. So if you keep doing the same thing every day, your body will adapt so well, it won't even respond to the stimulus. It'll be 2-hour run on a Sunday, body's like, yeah, okay. But if you mix it up, or you run on different terrains, or if you negative split it, or if you chuck a fartlek in the middle, or mix things up. The other thing is all this indoor training. I'm blown away. I'm blown away that someone would prefer to sit on a Zwift and sit inside than go and ride outside. Like, lockdown is a punishment. So why are you volunteering to lock yourself down and sit inside? Like, I completely understand if you have to do that. You've got work, it's dangerous where you live, or, I don't know, you live in a war zone. You can't get outside. But lockdown, wow. Don't you enjoy the outdoors?
To tune into the full episode, jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from, and the Physical Performance Show is also now available over on YouTube. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Renee McGregor, on this expert edition, leading UK-based sports dietitian and author on all things fueling for health and performance. What would you say to, I've heard it said that most athletes have a unique relationship with food and perhaps to some degree, maybe all, a degree of orthorexia. I mean, I don't know of an endurance athlete, recreational, or even, the pointy end of performance that in some ways maybe doesn't obsess about body weight, but they're very, very aware of it, and they're very aware of the relationship between fueling and output in affecting that. Watts per kilo for cyclists and the fear of excess weight for running. What would you say to the athlete listening in how would you encourage them around their relationship with food if that's something that they're regularly thinking about and concerned about?
I think firstly, remember what I said at the beginning of this podcast, which is energy balance is complex. And, actually to maintain a really healthy body, you need a very high intake of energy and a relatively high training output. So and obviously you're probably doing that if you're listening to this podcast. So that's the first thing, as in you've got the high training output, but maybe not have the high intake. But that is really, really important. The fear will always be, if I increase my intake, will my weight go up? And that's always the fear. But actually, reality is that if you increase your intake, probably your metabolic rate is going to go up and you are going to find yourself feeling a lot better. But it's having the confidence to be able to take that step up. It was something I actually did probably 4 or 5 years ago, because I've always been a runner and done lots of ultra running and crazy things like that. And I was definitely stuck in that, even though I'm mindful and I know, but I think I was definitely stuck in that kind of, I don't need to eat as much, I don't need to eat as much, and, all that kind of stuff. And I think, through study, through understanding, through learning, I started to increase, and actually probably my performance and my body composition just improved significantly. Even though I'm in my 40s, it was like, probably the leanest I've ever been. And that's not through eating less, that's actually through eating more, so it's quite interesting, I think. And the other thing I would say is that it's not about weight. Like, we focus so much on that number, but actually, again, you go and look at the studies, it's body composition that has the impact on your performance. If you're leaner, then you are going to probably move more efficiently. If you're leaner, you are going to have more power. But you're only going to be lean if you have enough energy. And leanness is not just your physical look. It's what's going on internally. It's, how much body fat percentage do you have? And again, being mindful of that. Like, you don't want to push that to the point where it becomes so low that that's going to affect your immune system and your ability to train and recover. You want it to be optimal, which is the place where your hormones and everything can work together to create that output. But I think the other thing to remember is that food, body is only one very small part of training, right? And performance. There's training technique, there's training load, there's periodization, there's the trainers you wear, there's so much there. There's the rest, there's the recovery. It's not just food alone, and it's not just body composition alone. And yet that's the one thing everybody focuses on, because it's the one thing that to a certain degree you probably have more influence over than anything else.
No, there's so much there. That's so rich. I really like that. It's not about weight. It's about body composition. And you can't see that on the scale unless it's, quite in most instances, and you certainly can't see that in the mirror. So that's profound. Renee, final few questions here. What would you say the top 3 mistakes athletes make when it comes to fueling? I know it's a difficult question. I'm putting you on the spot.
I think the biggest mistake athletes make is not eating enough carbohydrate, because carbohydrate has become the fear food. Everybody's fearful of it, and yet it's the food group that is so essential for good performance. And again, you go back to studies in the 60s and then the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and we have time and time again shown that we need carbohydrate as the preferred fuel source by our body. And again, if you go back and look at the studies around thyroid function and hypothalamic and pituitary axis and the production of T3 in particular, which is one of your thyroid hormones, if carbohydrate availability is low, then you're not going to produce enough T3. And if you don't produce enough T3, then you're going to downregulate other systems within the body. So I think the biggest thing I see is carbohydrate availability. The other thing I think is maybe not a nutritional concern, but is athletes seem to think more is better. So the more you do, the more training you do, the more impact you do, the more intensity you do, the better you're going to be. And that is definitely not the case, because the body needs to rest. The body, you only really adapt on your rest days. Yeah. But also, it's not just about the physical, it's about the mental. We know that we're our most creative when we give ourselves downtime. And I think fundamentally, another thing athletes don't do enough is reflect. They're so busy with massive expectations. And the thing about expectations and being somebody that has high expectations is that you generally then have created an outcome that you're expecting to happen. But if that outcome doesn't happen, you don't know how to manage that, then you can become disappointed. And that's when that can again feed back into that sense of unworthiness and not being good enough. So I think learning to manage expectations is a really important thing that all athletes need to know, probably more so than, how much training they should be doing.
Yeah, no, brilliant. So top 3 mistakes: not eating enough carbohydrate, mistake in the believing that more is better, and not managing expectations. Renee, if you could boil everything, it's a challenging question, that you've learned to date through your career to date into one piece of advice to help listeners of this show perform at their physical best, what would Renee McGregor's sports dietitian single piece of advice be?
Oh my goodness, that's a really tough one. Because a few things spring to mind, but I think the one thing I would say is, I think try and work towards that unconditional acceptance. Because I think if you have that, you're still going to perform at your best. You're still going to be a great version of yourself. But you also have the ability to reflect, rationalize, and give yourself the space you need to become a more robust and resilient athlete moving forward. So I think working on that unconditional acceptance of yourself is probably fundamentally, I think not just to athletes, I'd say to anybody, is so important moving through this very crazy world that we live in.
Totally. That's brilliant. Work towards unconditional acceptance of yourself. Renee, every guest of the show, as you know, issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. Now, you can extend that into your domain however you like, but what's Renee McGregor's physical challenge going to be to listeners?
I am going to challenge you all to do a bit of journaling, because I think journaling is really, really important. So what I mean by that is not reams and reams and reams of pages, but literally 10 minutes in the morning. What are your intentions? What self-care practices are you going to put into place? And then 10 minutes in the evening of, what went well today? What are the key thoughts that you've had to deal with? And what are you grateful for? What are you thankful for? Like these, I think if you do this every day, you get a really good understanding of what's going on for you, but also you start to work through what's going on up here rather than constantly cycling it. and never getting out of it. It's a bit like when you're constantly thinking it, you're just like you're going round and round and round and round a roundabout, and you keep missing the exit. But if you put some of it down, then you can go on your journey. And I think that's kind of the way I look at it.
That's powerful. So the power of journaling, the challenge is to journal for a week straight every day, or 2 days in a row? Do you want to any specific?
Try and do a week. I think if you do a week, you'll definitely notice that you'll want to continue.
All right, so 1 week. It's the Renee McGregor challenge for the week. Renee, you are prolific. You're easily found on Instagram at @R_McGregor. Your website's an absolute compendium of great tools and resources, which we'll definitely link up in the show notes, reneemcgregor.com. You're also busy outputting a podcast, the Train Brave podcast with Chris Hendy there of Strength for Endurance, and I believe you're about to kick off your second season.
Well, we've actually done 4. So we've got 4 series out. We're having a little break before we go into series 5 because actually we're going to change up the format a little bit. So it's going to be me, and then it'll be one other guest, but it will change every week depending on what we're going to discuss. We've got quite an interesting new format that I'm quite excited about, something a bit different, because we've done a lot of chat around REDS and training and nutrition, and I think this will be fun. This will be something a bit different for people to learn from more than anything else.
Brilliant. So, I encourage listeners to jump over if you want to find out more about this topic, and absolutely tune into the Train Brave podcast. And Renee, certainly I know that the UK is doing it tough, so it's early for you there. So all the best on the journey ahead, and thank you for your contribution to all of our learnings today with your sharings.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's been such a lovely conversation. And like I said, I was very excited when I got the invite. So, it's been my absolute pleasure. And you guys too. I hope things move for us all and that we can all move freely again at some point in the near future.
Yeah, hear, hear. Renee McGregor, thank you for your contribution. So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I trust and I know you enjoyed today's episode featuring Renee McGregor. Be sure to let Renee know what it was that you enjoyed from the show at @R_McGregor, McGregor on Instagram. Jump over to Renee's website, Renee McGregor, RENEE McGregor.com. Check out the books, the fantastic publications, Orthorexia, When Healthy Eating Goes Bad, and the Training Food series as well. As you heard, Renee's also outputting a fantastic podcast, Train Brave, so check that out on iTunes as well. Now, a massive thanks to this week's show sponsor, Precision Hydration. Yes, they are a sponsor of the show, but I personally choose to use Precision Hydration for my training and my upcoming Ironman debut in Cairns in 2021. If you struggled with hydration issues, including cramp, or you just like to get your hydration dialed in, then jump over to precisionhydration.com, take the free online sweat test, book a free 20-minute video call to discuss your hydration plan and the outcome of your sweat test, and then use the code PERFORMANCE, 15, to get 15% off your first order of electrolytes. Once again, precisionhydration.com. Big thanks to those that have been supporting the show through our Learnings membership over at Patreon. That's where you can support the show for just $5 per month. As we say, podcasts, whilst free to download, are not free to produce. So those that have supported the show, your support means a lot. And for those considering supporting the show, then rest assured we'd like to say thank you back and grant you free access to the back catalogue of live stream events, Dr. Shona Halson and Dr. Stephen Seiler, and any future upcoming live stream events, which are normally ticketed at $49 per person. And from 2020's experience, the live streams are very popular. If you are an athlete, endurance athlete, struggling with bone, tendon, or joint concerns, then don't forget you can jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth, and there you can schedule your online 45-minute telehealth consult. This is a service myself and the Pogo Physio practitioners provide worldwide and interstate to runners and triathletes. Common injuries include bone stress, Achilles tendons, kneecap pain, and much more. And the online world is extremely effective in sorting those concerns out. So jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the show, leave a rating and review over on iTunes if you'd like, and follow the show over on social at Physical Performance Show. Keep the podsies coming. They are always a lot of fun at Physical Performance Show. If you've got any feedback for myself regarding the direction of the show or a guest that you'd like to feature, you'll find myself on social at Brad_beer, or drop me an email, b.beer@pogophysio.com.au. Lastly, a huge thanks to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, you will be in for a real treat as we share with you a conversation that I recently had with professional cyclist, now turned professional Ironman triathlete, Australian-born Adam Hansen. And Adam outlines his career highs, lows, and learn-ins. And what a career it has been for Adam. He has just retired from the professional cycling peloton after completing a record-breaking 29 grand tours. Now, a grand tour is a 3-week cycling tour, either the Tour of Italy, the Giro, Tour of Spain, or, of course, the Tour de France. And Adam shares some fantastic insights into how he has been able to perform at such a high level across a 20-year professional cycling career. He discusses fueling, training, technology, and much more. So be sure to be tuning in next week to the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.